What if I told you that we are on the verge of a global economic shift, and almost no one is prepared for what's coming? In the coming weeks, months, or maybe years, decisions being made right now by leaders that many don't even take seriously could unleash consequences that go far beyond politics. This video is not about opinions. It's about overlooked facts, analyses rarely shared, and risks already underway. Based on the insights of one of the world's most respected economists, Richard Wolff, we'll decode what's truly at stake. And if you think this doesn't affect you, think again. What's at risk is your job, your purchasing power, and the future of the global economy as we know it. The myth of presidential control over the economy. While many people hope elected leaders will fix economic crises with strong speeches and quick promises, the truth is very different. The President of the United States, whoever it is, does not control inflation. This is a political illusion that has persisted for decades. Richard Wolff makes it clear: no presidential order can reverse inflation. The economy is like a massive engine with multiple global gears: supply, demand, supply chains, international conflicts, debt, and it doesn't respond to executive orders at the speed political campaigns promise. Saying a president will fix inflation with the stroke of a pen is like promising to teach someone to jump over the Empire State Building. It's theatrical, and worse, it's dangerous, because it distances the population from a real understanding of the problem. Inflation is driven by factors like energy crises, disastrous trade policies, wars, disrupted production, and logistical collapses. Ignoring these and pretending that pushing a button in Washington can fix everything creates a misinformed population, and therefore a more vulnerable one. When we realize that the economy is the real engine and politics is just the passenger trying to adjust its seatbelt during an earthquake, we begin to grasp the magnitude of the challenge. And that challenge only grows when simplistic answers are presented as solutions to complex problems, which leads us to the next point. Simple solutions to complex problems. It's in this climate of confusion that the so-called magic solutions emerge. Those catchy phrases that fit on a bumper sticker but can't sustain an economic policy. A classic example? Drill, baby, drill. The idea that simply drilling more oil wells will solve inflation sounds tempting. After all, more oil means more supply, and more supply, in theory, lowers prices. But this logic ignores almost everything that truly matters. Inflation is multifactorial. It doesn't move solely because of fuel prices. There are tariffs being imposed, supply chains disrupted, trade wars underway, and a structural fragility in household consumption, all pieces of the puzzle. Even if more oil could, in theory, ease energy prices, it wouldn't address the side effects of protectionist policies, nor the surging cost of food, rent, and credit. Worse, these measures often come with environmental and diplomatic setbacks that create new medium-term problems. Richard Wolff is ironic. Proposing this as the main solution is like telling someone to train to jump over the Empire State Building. No matter how hard they try, it's simply not going to happen. And that mentality is dangerous, because it sells the illusion that we're in control, when in reality, we're just reacting. Worse, reacting poorly. The use of slogans like drill masks the need for structural reform and wastes valuable time with short-term illusions. But time is running out. While fiery speeches make headlines, real policies, like tariffs and mass deportations, are already being implemented, and their effects are far deeper than most realize. Tariffs as a dangerous economic weapon. While the public is distracted by catchy slogans, silent and devastating measures are being put into effect. Import tariffs, for instance, are sold as punishments to other countries. But in the end, it's the American consumer who foots the bill. Richard Wolff explains, tariffs are taxes, period. They are levies placed on products that come from abroad. When the government imposes tariffs on Mexican or Chinese goods, it doesn't hurt the enemy. It immediately raises the prices of everything on U.S. shelves, and it doesn't stop there. When you add to that the promise to deport millions of immigrant workers, you create a perfect storm. Immigrants send billions of dollars in remittances back to their home countries, especially Mexico. If that flow is interrupted, a significant portion of Mexico's economy collapses. At the same time, tariffs increase the cost of goods that Mexico exports to the United States, its largest trading partner. The result? A drastic drop in exports, factory closures, and a brutal rise in unemployment in the neighboring country. The consequence? A social and economic collapse along the southern border. Millions of people without income, without work, without alternatives. It's a chain reaction. Fewer exports, fewer jobs, more instability, more forced migration. And that comes back to the U.S. as an even bigger problem. Wolff calls this the triple blow: tariffs, plus deportations, plus collapse of remittances. It's a tested formula, and we know where it leads: regional chaos, economic instability, and a vicious cycle of crisis. The most ironic part? All of this is promoted under the banner of protecting the American worker. But how can you protect someone by creating domestic inflation, triggering a recession in a neighboring country, and destabilizing the border? While they talk about economic security, their actions produce the exact opposite. And the worst part is that this kind of mistake has been made before. Aggressive protectionism has precedence, and they didn't end well. The real risk of a new depression. When disastrous policies pile onto fragile economic structures, the outcome can be even more dangerous than it seems. And we're not just talking about inflation. Richard Wolff warns of a scenario that's rarely discussed: a new economic depression, similar to what happened in Japan a few decades ago. After a speculative boom, Japan faced a long period of deflation, a time when prices fell not due to efficiency, but because the economy stopped moving. In the United States, household debt is at record highs. The same goes for corporate debt. This means millions of people and businesses are, quite literally, at their limit. If policies like tariffs and deportations worsen the cost of living, many of these debts will become unpayable. And when consumers can't pay, they stop spending. When businesses can't pay, they lay off workers or shut down. What looked like a simple slowdown turns into a collapse. The risk, therefore, isn't just rising prices, but economic breakdown, a sharp drop in demand, a freeze in investment, a standstill in production. All of this is fertile ground for a depression. The most dangerous part? The policies claiming to fight inflation might actually be pushing the economy off a cliff. And what's being ignored in campaign speeches could soon become the nightmare of millions. But the risks don't stop there. When the United States ignores international agreements in favor of domestic solutions, the consequences ripple across the world. The price of breaking international agreements. The global economic system runs on a fragile foundation of trust and predictability. And when that foundation is broken, the cost is steep, even for superpowers. During his first term, Donald Trump renegotiated NAFTA, the treaty guaranteeing free trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and signed a new version reaffirming America's commitment to tariff-free trade among these countries. But now, by unilaterally proposing new tariffs against Mexico, he's breaking the very agreement he signed. Richard Wolff is clear. This is not just a policy shift. It's a breach of international contract. And when a nation breaks agreements without a plausible justification, it undermines its global credibility. Trade partners, foreign investors, and multinational corporations begin to wonder, if the U.S. broke this deal, what's the next one they'll break? This distrust drives away investments, slows down international projects, and forces countries to rethink their alliances. After all, Who wants to rely economically on an unpredictable partner? Worse, the justifications given for these breaches, like fighting drug trafficking through trade barriers, are weak, inconsistent, and hardly defensible in front of international bodies. The result? A damaged image, strained partnerships, and a global leadership increasingly questioned. Breaking trade agreements is not just a technical decision. It's a political message. We're no longer reliable. And once trust is broken, it takes decades to rebuild. But this paradigm shift doesn't stop at trade alliances. It also reveals a deep change in the identity of those defending such measures. And in that, there's a glaring contradiction within American politics itself. The contradictions of the Republican Party. For over a century, the Republican Party has built its image on two main pillars: tax cuts and reducing the size of government. The banner of the free market has always been present in its speeches, campaigns, and economic proposals. But something has changed. Richard Wolff points out the central contradiction of the current moment. By proposing a widespread tariff policy, the party that once presented itself as a champion of economic freedom is, in practice, proposing tax increases. Yes, because tariffs are exactly that. Taxes on imports, paid by American consumers and businesses. To maintain the rhetoric, however, these tariffs are framed as defensive tools against foreign nations. A semantic trick, but one that doesn't change the practical reality. The cost falls on the American people. This dissonance reveals a growing gap between ideological discourse and political practice. And once again, the risk is not only economic, it's also about internal credibility. If the party that promised to cut taxes is now increasing them, what else will be abandoned in the name of short-term populism? These contradictions are also starting to generate external consequences, especially in countries directly impacted by these new policies. Collapse in Mexico. The boomerang effect. When contradictory domestic policies turn into concrete actions, the impact crosses borders. And Mexico is perhaps the most alarming example. Richard Wolff paints a clear picture. If the United States deports millions of immigrants, as promised, while simultaneously imposing tariffs on Mexican products, the effect will be devastating for the neighboring country's economy. First, because these deportations would cut off billions of dollars in remittances sent by Mexican workers in the U.S. This money supports entire families and represents a key inflow of capital into Mexico. Second, the tariffs make Mexican goods more expensive for American consumers. The result? A drop in exports and factory closures in Mexico, since its largest market is being artificially weakened. Third, mass unemployment. Without remittances and without exports, businesses collapse, and millions lose their livelihoods. What remains is a country on the brink of social collapse, facing a new wave of forced migration, internal violence, and political instability, all right at the doorstep of the world's largest economy. Wolff calls this the triple blow. The combined actions, deportations, tariffs, and loss of remittances operate like a ticking time bomb. And the worst part, the U.S. will be the first to feel the consequences of this collapse. Instead of containing crises, these policies manufacture new ones. It's the classic boomerang effect. What seems like protection ends up coming back even stronger. And all of this stems from decisions that ignore the complexity of economic interdependence between nations. But to understand how we got here, we need to look at history, and at an old argument that's resurfacing now. The old infant industry argument. To justify tariffs and the closing of economic borders, some politicians are reviving an old idea, the infant industry argument. According to this logic, when a country is developing its first industries, it must protect them from external competition, especially from more advanced economies. Only then would these emerging companies have time to grow and become competitive. In the 19th century, the United States itself used this argument against England. And yes, it worked for a time. But it's precisely because the US once employed this tactic that the current contradiction is so glaring. Today, as the world's most advanced power, the US is recycling the same protectionist narrative, but now to shield itself from developing countries. It's as if the strongest student in class were asking for help to avoid being outperformed by a beginner. Richard Wolff emphasizes that this kind of distortion is symptomatic of a declining economy. Instead of pursuing innovation, competitiveness, and global cooperation, the country begins to close itself off, afraid of its own past. Worse still, the selective use of this argument reveals that behind these tariffs, there is no coherent strategy, but rather a desperate attempt to contain inevitable losses. This shift in posture is more than just strategic. It symbolizes the beginning of a global change in the discourse on international trade. And it calls into question the role of the United States as a defender of the free market. And it's precisely this reversal that leads us to the next point: free trade versus protectionism, a historic shift. For decades, the United States was the world's leading advocate of free trade. It created treaties, pressured countries to open their markets, and used its power to shape the global economy based on the idea that markets should be free and open. But now, in a historic turn, that same country is embracing protectionism, tariffs, renegotiated agreements, threats of trade sanctions. From champion of globalization, the US now acts as if it's at war with it. Richard Wolff points out that this change is not the result of a new economic philosophy. It's a symptom of structural decline. When a powerful economy begins to lose competitiveness, it turns inward. It tries to protect itself. It shuts its doors. And the most ironic part? As the US isolates itself, China adopts the free trade narrative. Xi Jinping appears at international forums promoting openness, dialogue, and cooperation, exactly the role the US played throughout much of the 20th century. This creates an unprecedented scenario. The emerging power defends globalization, while the former leader tries to shield itself from it. The world watches, confused, and begins to reorganize around this new logic. Europe, for example, is already debating whether to follow the US into protectionism or to align more closely with China to secure its own trade interests. This shift in the axis of trade discourse is profound. It doesn't just affect treaties or tariffs. It redefines alliances, influences investments, and alters the global flow of capital. And this new phase of the global economy brings with it one of the market's greatest fears: uncertainty. The chaos of economic uncertainty. Uncertainty is perhaps the most destructive element for any economy. And when it comes to unstable trade policies, this effect multiplies. For years, the world operated within a relatively predictable system. There were disputes, yes, but also rules, treaties, and formal commitments that gave companies and governments a foundation to plan for the future. Now, all of that is crumbling. Richard Wolff explains that the problem with tariffs isn't just their cost, it's the unpredictability with which they're proposed, changed, or revoked. No company is willing to invest billions in a new plant if it doesn't know what the rules will be next month. A clear example: automakers like Mitsubishi and Nissan canceled plans to build factories in Mexico. The reason? Uncertainty over tariffs. If the US imposes taxes on parts produced there, the entire cross-border production model becomes unviable. And it's not just foreign companies hesitating. Even American corporations are paralyzed. How can you plan long-term investments when the rules of the game change with every tweet? This freeze in decision-making directly affects the economic engine. When companies don't invest, they don't hire. When they don't hire, consumption drops. And when consumption drops, other companies reduce production. It's a self-reinforcing negative cycle. Capitalism, Wolff reminds us, runs on trust. Investors risk capital today because they believe in returns tomorrow. If tomorrow is a question mark, capital retreats, and with it, the economy. And the consequence of all this has a name: recession. Not a mild, cyclical recession, but a structural, prolonged one, caused not by a lack of resources, but by an excess of fear. And the worst part? This fear is being artificially manufactured by erratic decisions and unstable rhetoric. But to understand how this cycle completes, we need to examine how capitalism itself functions and what happens when it stops, when capitalism stops turning. To understand the real impact of this paralysis, one must grasp the basic mechanics of the capitalist system. And Richard Wolff puts it simply: capitalism is a circuit. The money you earn comes from what someone else spends, and what you spend supports someone else's salary. When the cycle runs smoothly, the economy turns. But if one gear jams, whether due to declining consumption, stalled investment, or surging prices, everything begins to slow down. The working class, as Wolff explains, rarely manages to save. Most people spend everything they earn, often more, through credit. Meanwhile, large corporations accumulate profits and choose strategically when and where to invest. The problem? When uncertainty hits, those corporations decide to wait. And when they wait, capital stops circulating. Projects are postponed. Hiring is frozen. Production is cut. It's like a domino effect. A small delay in investment leads to unemployment, which reduces consumption, which affects more companies, and so on. In other words, when the 3% who decide where capital is invested hit the brakes, the other 97% who depend on that flow are left adrift. This is the critical point. The policy of tariffs and aggressive rhetoric doesn't just impact foreign trade. It threatens the very engine of the domestic economy. And that leads us into even shakier ground: the paradox between inflation and recession, the economic paradox of tariffs. Here we reach one of the most dangerous ironies of this entire economic strategy. Tariffs are proposed as a way to curb inflation, but they might end up causing the opposite, or worse, something even less predictable. Richard Wolff highlights the paradox. Yes, tariffs tend to push prices up, since imported goods become more expensive. But if those same tariffs trigger a deep recession, with falling consumption, tighter credit, and job cuts, prices may actually fall. Companies facing recession know they can't pass on rising costs to consumers, so they hold prices, slash margins, and in some cases, liquidate inventory just to keep cash flowing. What was meant to be an anti-inflation measure becomes fuel for a recessionary spiral. And the most dangerous part? No one knows which scenario will prevail. Will we see persistent inflation or sudden deflation? Will prices rise or collapse? The result is an environment where no one can plan. And when planning disappears, trust vanishes. And without trust, as we've seen, capitalism stops turning. And when that happens on a global scale, isolation is only a matter of time. The U.S. isolation in the global arena. The collapse of internal trust would already be a major issue. But when that distrust spreads to the global stage, the effects are even deeper and longer lasting. Richard Wolff warns that faced with the United States' unpredictable policies, companies and governments around the world are doing exactly what any rational actor would: diversifying risk and seeking alternatives. The message is clear. Today, the U.S. is a volatile partner. It imposes tariffs arbitrarily, breaks treaties, and uses the economy as a political weapon. In response, countries and international corporations are gradually reducing their dependence on the American economy. Imports, exports, investments, tech agreements, everything is being rerouted. And there's a clear destination for this shift: China. With a growingly robust economy and a narrative of stability and openness, China is reaping the benefits of the vacuum left by the United States. European companies, in particular, are strengthening ties with Beijing. including traditionally US-aligned industries like German manufacturing. And it's not about ideological boycotts, it's commercial survival. No country wants to be held hostage by an unpredictable market. And today, the one appearing more predictable, even under an authoritarian system, is China. This quiet reconfiguration may leave the US isolated, not through direct rejection, but through pure economic logic. After all, why keep investing in a partner that could flip the table at any moment? This isolation won't be immediate or dramatic. It will be gradual, but its signs are already showing. And the next stage is even deeper: a reorganization of the global economic order as we know it. A new economic order in the making. The progressive distancing from the United States is not happening in a vacuum. It's making way for something deeper: the formation of a new global economic order. Richard Wolff explains that we're witnessing a shift in the axis of power. For the first time in over a century, the US and Europe are no longer the unquestionable center of global economic activity. A combination of protectionist policies, internal instability, and geopolitical conflict is pushing the global system toward a new framework, more decentralized, more Asian, more multipolar. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are growing stronger. Together, they already represent around 60% of the global population and a rising share of the world's GDP. And unlike in the past, they now trade with each other, invest in each other, and build their own financial and cooperation structures as alternatives to the US-led model. Europe, faced with American unpredictability, is searching for new balances. Germany, for example, is already deeply integrated with China. France is exploring strategic alliances beyond the traditional axis. And even smaller countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa are positioning themselves with more independence. This new order won't be declared in conferences or headlines. It's being built quietly through bilateral deals, investment flows, and trade networks that bypass Washington. And that means the United States, unless it changes course, may find itself in a position it never imagined, on the sidelines of the very game it once dominated. But the problem doesn't stop there. Every misguided decision in the present leaves scars on the future, and the bill always comes due. The bill for the future. Political and economic decisions rarely show their full effects immediately. They grow over time, silently gaining force, until, suddenly, they become unavoidable. And that's exactly what Richard Wolff warned. The bill is coming. Mass adoption of tariffs, abandonment of agreements, gradual isolation. At first glance, all of this may look like a show of strength. But, like a risky loan, the interest is piling up. And it will be paid, not today, maybe not even in the next election cycle, but in the years to come. Companies that remain silent today may move their factories elsewhere tomorrow. Governments that tolerate today may retaliate tomorrow. Investors who hesitate now may cut ties permanently later. And the impacts won't be purely economic. They'll show up as lost jobs, higher prices, restricted access to strategic markets, and most of all, loss of global influence. Wolff compares this path to a poorly planned project. You take the money now, place a big bet, and you may not even be around when the bill arrives. But someone, or an entire nation, will have to pay. And what once seemed like a political win could turn into a historical burden. The danger of economic arrogance. There's something even more dangerous than the economic impacts themselves: the denial of reality. Richard Wolff points to the behavior of leaders who ignore data, reject expert analysis, and prefer to feed their base with empty slogans. This kind of economic arrogance may be the greatest risk of all, because it turns bad decisions into permanent policy. It's like driving full speed toward a wall. and accelerating because someone shouted, "Trust the driver." See, Trump, by downplaying the effects of tariffs and selling empty promises as definitive solutions, embodies this mindset. And he's not alone. Many around him act as if economic consequences are just about narrative, not actual outcome. During the pandemic, we were told inflation would be transitory. It was denied until it became unavoidable. Now we're hearing that tariffs are a necessary bitter pill. But who's to say the patient will survive the dose? Arrogance and ignorance go hand in hand, and when combined with power, they become explosive. Denying economic complexity doesn't make the world simpler, it just makes it more dangerous. And history shows that those who ignore the warning signs are almost always the ones who pay the highest price. In light of all this, one truth must be clear. Understanding the economy is no longer optional. It's a survival skill. You don't need to be an economist to feel the effects of these decisions in your daily life. It's in the price of groceries, in rising rent, in the fear of losing your job, in the instability you sense even if you can't explain why. But there's a quiet power in knowledge. When you understand the mechanics behind the headlines, you stop being manipulated by easy rhetoric. You start recognizing patterns, interests, and, most importantly, consequences. Richard Wolff shows us that behind every economic policy lies a political agenda, and that those who suffer most are often nowhere near the table where those decisions are made. But knowledge bridges that distance, because every time you understand how the system works, you also understand where you can act, what to question, and how to protect yourself. The economy is not neutral. It favors some and penalizes others. But ignorance always favors the same few. So don't settle for shallow explanation. Don't accept empty slogans. Question, investigate, inform yourself. Because the more people understand, the less room there is for deception. And that's exactly what can turn passive viewers into conscious citizens. If you've made it this far, you're already ahead of 99% of people. But now comes the most important part: commitment. Not with this video, not with a passing thought, but with yourself. Because every transformation starts with a decision, and that decision becomes stronger when it's declared. So here's the challenge. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to take action." It may seem simple, but that phrase marks a turning point. It's the moment you stop being just a spectator and become the protagonist of your own financial and intellectual journey. And by writing it, you create a public anchor. That increases the chances that you'll truly act. Because when you declare your intention out loud, even digitally, your mind understands it's serious, that it's real, that it's now. And I'll be there, reading every comment, liking, supporting, acknowledging every person who chooses to commit to their own growth. This is the first step. Small? Yes, but that's how every journey begins. Economic freedom is not a privilege, it's a right. But only those who understand the game can claim that right. If you believe that, like the video, share it with someone who needs to understand what's coming. And subscribe to the channel, because the world is changing, and your best defense is knowledge.